so we're all feeling a bit giddy and warmed up on a Tuesday afternoon. So thank you, friends, for joining us. And again, thank you to our APS members for your support. Boy, I love that you come on each day and listen, and then subsequently, so many of you go onto the social media platforms and just sing it from the rooftops. What a great time you're having. And that really means so much, not only in terms of encouragement for all the staff here at APS, but really to get the word out and to promote. And, you know, membership is key for us for our thrive, for our livelihood as an organization. So all of that encouragement, all of those powerful sentiments and testimonials that you're sharing, I really appreciate it. We all appreciate it. Scott Tiffany spoke yesterday about the Adopt a Bookathon. I think that that's a great idea. If you have a special book that you just love, we have a really cool fundraising opportunity where you can immortalize that book, where you put in a nameplate and you can tell a little story about it. And that's one way of sharing your love of philately and you know, having some sort of a legacy for yourself in addition to the great life that you've obviously led as philatelists. So again, just wanted to thank you and reiterate that really cool fundraising, the Adopt a Book. Dr. Richard Morel, an APS member, is on our stamp chat today, and he is coming to us from London. And I see some of our guests are also coming from us across the pond. Hi, Jack. Hi, Peter Little. Thank you so much for joining us. And Richard is here to talk about something that I know is near and dear to our hearts, which is the Black postal history, that story. You know, all the various stories that exist out there in history that we can convey through postal history. It's a very unique opportunity to experience that story. So he'll be bringing us today the Caribbean African communities in British postal history. There was a great postal history article in the newsroom, if you saw it. That'll correlate very well with this talk at the end. At the end, I can direct you over. So, Dr. Richard Morel, thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead, your screen is shared, and I'm going to mute everyone. Just give me a moment, Richard, and then I'll unmute you solo.
Okay, everyone, thank you for coming. I hope you'll enjoy it. It's still research in progress, so it really just touches the tip of the iceberg. So the important national contributions made by Britain's Black communities are becoming increasingly recognised and celebrated. Yet what role, if any, did postal or other communication networks play in the lives of individuals from Africa or the Caribbean? In a subject and hobby widely perceived to be pale, male and frail, does postal history have the potential to make significant and original contributions to the study of Black history? This presentation is going to attempt some tentative answers to such questions by discussing a range of separate case studies from various collections within the archives of the British Library and elsewhere. So our first case study relates to the Guinea coast trade of the East India Company, a little-known subject prior to the pioneering work of my former line manager and colleague, Dr. Margaret Makepeace, during the 1980s, early 1990s. Now, Britain's civil wars and their consequent political upheavals provided the London East India Company with a very brief opportunity to establish some temporary trading posts or settlements known as factories on the Guinea coast of West Africa between 1657 and 1666. And as you can see in the images here, I have the headquarters of the East India Company's house at the time in Leadenhall Street, as well as a slightly later image showing one of the settlements, and fortunate enough as well to have a photograph of that, which is actually freely available on Wikipedia. I've been there and it's quite an evocative site. The company's main settlement was based at Fort Cormentine, which is in the photograph, and this is in present-day Ghana. But the company also established additional satellite factories based at the Cape Coast, Winneba, Anto, Tantanquary and Benin. And the bulk of the company's trade comprised of cargoes of textiles and manufactured goods shipped from England for Africa, where they were then exchanged for gold and ivory, which was then sent to India to purchase other commodities that were shipped back to London for sale. And the company's merchants were actively prohibited by their employers from engaging directly in the transatlantic slave trade. Nevertheless, they did request or ship out several shipments of African labourers to the company's other settlements at St. Helena, Pulo Run and Bantam in Southeast Asia. And the very high mortality rates within the English population at these settlements also necessitated a complement of black labourers to help run and maintain the fort. Developing strong alliances with African rulers was essential to the success of the East India Company's trade in the region. And this is a fact further compounded by the intense rivalry with the Dutch and other European rivals. Now, occasionally, the relationships would break down and disputes would occur with local ruling elite, which would result in the factories being looted. Following the restoration of Charles II to the British throne in 1660, he eventually issued a charter to the British Adventurers into Africa, or the Royal Africa Company, which took over the monopoly of trade and eventually forced the East India Company's eventual closure of its trade, and it abandoned its fort. In 1665, the Dutch captured Fort Cormontein and changed its name to Fort Amsterdam, and it formed part of the Dutch Gold Coast right the way up to 1868. Now, the following letter, dated the 1st of May 1658, was written by one of the English merchants at Fort Cormontein named Ralph Johnson, and it was addressed to the governor and directors of the London East India Company, addressed at Leadenhall Street in London. And the letter would have travelled from West Africa to India on board one of the company's ships, and was then privately conveyed on its arrival to the company's London office. Annotations on the back of this particular letter revealed that it reached its final destination on the 2nd of October, so a period of about 5 months in transit. Now, although there were no postal markings on this per se, many of these routes, mercantile routes that were kind of set up, formed the kind of proto-history of many of the mail routes of the later period. And of course, these various English East India companies, including the Royal Africa Company, in fact, any colonial-based organisation, managed their overseas trade, interest and settlement via such letters and other means of written communication. An empire of writing, if you will. And although written by European rather than black writers, such letters and such ventures had a profound direct impact on the lives of countless numbers of black men, women and children from Africa and the Caribbean, the influence of which kind of still reverberates right the way through to the present day. The second case study is a petition also housed within the India Office records. And it was actually a manuscript I had the personal good fortune to catalog way back in 2001. And it recounts the story of a Captain White, who around 1716 sailed into Delagoa Bay, Maputo Bay, in kind of modern day Mozambique, to trade under the license of the East India Company. And during his stay, White entertained a local ruler and his 2 brothers on board of his ship. And the 2 princes obtained permission from the local ruler to go and visit England with Captain White, who promised to take good care of them, provided the king defrayed the costs of the voyage for the princes with valuable trading commodities. Anyway, they departed from Maputo Bay and they sailed on to stop at Madagascar, where they purchased some slaves before sailing to Jamaica, where White sold the princes into slavery. Whilst they were enslaved, and Mr. Bowles heard their story and purchased them from their masters and set sail with them for England. And unfortunately, a hurricane struck, causing the ship to sink off Cape Carriento on Cuba. And Bowles drowned, but the princes survived together with a few other passengers, including a Colonel John Toogood, who took them to England. And in September 1760, Toogood submitted this petition to the East India Company's Court of Directors, requesting financial support and assistance to get the 2 princes returned home to Maputo Bay. Now, patronage of the 2 princes in London provided a potential opportunity to further develop trade in the southeast coast of Africa. So consequently, the East India Company initiated discussions with the Royal Africa Company over the right to establish trade in the region. This dragged on for over a year. And during this time, both princes were maintained and educated at the expense of the Royal Africa Company. and they were taught about Christianity by Thomas Bray and baptized with the names of John and James at Twickenham in June 1721. Contemporary records, online records, we were actually able to identify their names as James Macquillan Massoum and John Trung Massoum. And the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge wanted the princes to return accompanied with a missionary. And the man appointed for the task was a Marmaduke Powell, who sailed with them and received £500 salary from the East India Company. And they set sail from Gravesend, where the ship struck a rock and had to put into Exmouth for repairs in 1722. And whilst there, the older of the two princes hung himself, commit suicide. No one really knows why, but perhaps from a frenzy or depression or a quarrel with his brother. No one really knows. But when the surviving prince, John and Penwell, reached Maputo Bay, the prince went into his mother's house and literally shut the door in the missionary's face. And the prince emerged later, and he was giving such frowns to the missionary that the missionary just gave up and returned home. So it's quite interesting because this kind of correspondence was being sent locally, but at the same time, a white writer using the postal services is actually able to influence the lives of enslaved Africans. And the themes of writing, self-interested white intervention and release from slavery is followed up in the third case study. And it's a postal history of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, also known as Joe Ben Solomon, who's pictured here. And he was born in 1701 in Bundu, Senegal, West Africa. And he was born into a prominent family of Muslim religious leaders who founded the town of Bundu. Anyway, in 1730, he traveled with his interpreter towards the Gambia River to trade in slaves and paper. And on the return trip home, they were both captured by invading Mandingos and sold to the factors of the English Royal African Company. Diallo was shipped across the Atlantic to Annapolis within the British colony of Maryland and sold to a Mr. Tolsey from Kent Island. And he was initially put to work in tobacco fields, but was found unsuitable for this work, so eventually was placed in charge of cattle. And he was a devout Muslim, as evidenced by the Quran around his neck in the portrait. And he would regularly go to pray into the nearby woods. But after an occasion where he was humiliated by a child, Diallo eventually ran away and was shortly after captured and imprisoned at Kent County Courthouse. And it was here that he came to the attention of a Reverend Thomas Blewett, a lawyer and member of the Anglican Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And learning that Diallo could write Arabic, Blewett made inquiries via an interpreter into Diallo's background, and he encouraged Diallo's owner to write a letter in Arabic to his father in Africa. Now, this letter was shipped across to England for conveyance to Africa, where it came to the attention of James Oglethorpe, depicted here, who was the founder of the colony of Georgia and a director of the Royal African Company, which held the monopoly on the West African trade. Now, after the letter was authenticated by John Gagnier, Professor Chair at Arabic at Oxford, Oglethorpe purchased Diallo for £45 and shipped him across to England. Now, the British Library has the actual letter which secured Diallo's freedom from enslavement. And it's here on this slide, and you can see on the left that the address of the recipient are written both in English and French, illuminating the Anglo-French colonial rivalry occurring in the region. And the letter's content, written in Arabic, informs all the Muslims of Bundu that Diallo is alive and urges his family and authorities to forbid his two wives from remarrying. Now, when Diallo arrived in London in April 1733, whilst negotiations and preparations were underway to secure his freedom and passage back home, he was able to fraternise with London's social elite, including members of the royal family, John Montagu, who we'll hear more about on the left here, depicted later, and Sirhan Sloane, who's a famous collector. His collections went on to form the foundation of the British Museum, Natural History Museum, Botanical Gardens and the British Library. And in fact, Sirhan Sloane employed Diallo to assist him in organising and translating his collection of Persian amulets with Quranic inscriptions. And by July 1734, Diallo returned to Gambia, sadly discovered that his father had died and one of his wives had remarried. And although his country was ravaged by war, his wealth enabled him to regain his old lifestyle. And he wrote an autobiography entitled Some Memories of the Life of Job, the son of Solomon, high priest of Bunda in Africa. And it's one of the earliest published English and French slave narratives. The following letter on the left here, written in Arabic with an accompanying English translation underneath, was written by Diallo at Fort James, Rio, in Gambia on the 8th of December 1734, shortly after his return home. The superscription on the back of the letter reveals that the letter was addressed to Sirhan Sloane in Arabic at the top. So you see the Arabic at the top says Sirhan Sloane, or it's a transliteration of his name. And it's addressed to his property in Bloomsbury Square, close to the present-day British Museum. And then in English underneath, the name and address have been put in English. And this letter was most likely carried from Gambia to England on an unidentified English ship. And it was charged with a 5p rate. And on its arrival, the letter was posted, and you can see the presence of a 26th of February bishop's mark. And the letter would have reached Sirhan Sloane soon afterwards. Regrettably, most postal historians ignore literary sources in their research. I'm hoping that the fourth case will demonstrate the kind of error in doing so. And it's going to look at the published letters of the early Black British valet, shopkeeper, composer, actor and writer Ignacio Sancho, who's depicted here. The Sancho was born in 1729 on a slave ship during its passage to New Granada, which was a Spanish colony kind of situated in present-day Colombia, Ecuador, Panama and Venezuela. His mother died soon after her arrival at the colony, and his father committed suicide rather than live life as a slave. And somehow this young orphan ended up in England under the ownership of three sisters from Greenwich. And it was here that he encountered John Montague, who encouraged Sancho to read, lending him books from the library at his house in Blackheath. And in 1749, Sancho fled from his owners, seeking refuge in the Duke's household, where he found employment as a butler for the Duchess of Montague until her death in 1751. He spent a few years out of doing various jobs, and in 1766 obtained employment as a valet to one of his old boss's relations, so another Duke of Montague. Now, by 1773, Sancho's health began to deteriorate with the onset of gout, and that effectively ended his career as a valet for the Duke of Montague. Nevertheless, with his former employer's assistance, Sancho was able to establish a greengrocer's shop at 19 Charles Street on the site of the current Foreign and Commonwealth Office building in Whitehall, Westminster. And being a financially independent male householder living in Westminster, Sancho was qualified to vote in the parliamentary elections of 1774 and 1780, the first person of African heritage known to have voted in Britain. As a shopkeeper, Sancho had time to socialise and correspond with his many friends, sharing his enjoyment of literature as well as publishing musical compositions, treatises, plays and political articles for various newspapers under the pseudonym of Africanus. And his acquaintances included the famous artist Thomas Gainsborough, the Shakespearean actor David Garrick and the sculptor Joseph Nollekens. He also received a lot of prominent customers to his shop, including the prominent Whig statesman Charles James Fox. And on the 14th of December 1780, Sancho died and was the first person of African descent to be given an obituary in the British press. Now, Sancho's reputation as a man of letters began in 1766 with the publication of his correspondence with the famous author Laurence Sterne, where he was encouraging the author to use his pen to lobby for the abolition of the slave trade. Sancho developed an extensive correspondence with a wide range of individuals during the second half of the 18th century, and one of these, a man called William Leach, collated and published 160 of these letters in a two-volume edition entitled The Letters of the Late Ignacio Sancho in African. And the book sold very well, with more than 2,000 people subscribing to it, and it enabled his widow to receive more than £500 in royalties, so a significant sum for the late 18th century. But this work contains a wealth of references to postal rates, post offices, and the conveyance of mail. Letter 8, here dated the 16th of July 1770, was addressed to a servant of the Montague household called James Kisby, And Sancho wrote it whilst in Dalkeith, Scotland, preparing to accompany the pregnant Duchess of Buccleuch back to London. And he had evidently received a letter from Kisby via the post, and in this reply complains about the cost. Your confounded epistle cost me 7p dues to take you. Why did you not enclose it? Letters and references within Sancho's letters also demonstrate that during the second half of the 18th century, there existed a small Black British community communicating and using the postal service. One notable example is Julius Obrien. He was of African descent and was brought to England from St Kitts at the age of 10. He became a favourite of Catherine Hyde, the Duchess of Queensberry, who subsidised quite an extravagant lifestyle for him. So he was known as a famous fencer. He was known as a bit of a fop, which is a word for people who were kind of into fashion and the like. And he was subsequently characterised in a range of racially stereotyped satirical prints and works, a couple of which are depicted here. Now, Sancho writes to him or about him on numerous occasions, urging him to reform his character because he was a bit of a womanizer without success. The following letter here, letter 13, was written by Sancho when he was in Richmond to Julius Sobiese, and it's dated the 11th of October 1772. And you know, in it, he's talking and hoping that you know, he'll start to behave himself a bit more. Nevertheless, Sancho makes it clear that he has no intention of actually paying to learn the outcome of his behaviour. And in this letter, Sancho complains to Sobiese, I shall be ever happy in your correspondence, but at the same time, I could not afford to pay 5p for the honour of your letters. 5p is a 12th part of 5 shillings, a 48th part of a pound. It would keep my girls in potatoes 2 days. The time may come when it may be necessary for you to study calculations. In the meantime, if you cannot get a franc, direct to me under the cover of His Grace, the Duke, i.e. the Duke of Montague. In another letter to one of his closest friends, the abolitionist, India Board official and artist John Mayhew, Sancho reports that he received a letter from Sobiese at St Helena. The dates don't tally. It's more likely he's on a ship in Portsmouth sailing out towards Asia. And in that letter that he received from Sobiese, he enclosed a letter addressed to his family, which he asks in Petersham in Richmond, which he asks Sancho to forward, which he does. And so it's quite interesting there. Now, in the letters so far, frequent references are made about obtaining a franc. Now, franked mail refers to letters sent through the post for free, most commonly under the signature of frank of someone with the privilege of sending and receiving at least some of their official mail without charge. And it was widely abused by those with the privilege who would frank mail for friends and contacts, and it resulted in the rules being increasingly tightened over the year. Part of the postal reform was working on dealing with this problem. And I've got a good example of, from the British Library's collections demonstrating an abuse of the franking privilege. This letter here is addressed from J. Cheshire in Leicester, and it's addressed to Sirhan Sloane again at his house in Bloomsbury Square. And it's dated the 9th of October 1734. And on the bottom you can see the word Frank G. Beaumont, suggesting it's been franked. But obviously the letter's been identified, a postal rate's been applied to it, and there's also the bishop's mark. So this was one that didn't get through. Now, the references that Sancho makes about obtaining francs demonstrates that his social networks extended to politicians and other government officials who were able to frank such letters. Nevertheless, obtaining francs was not always that straightforward. In this letter here from Sancho, his shop in Charles Street, addressed to his friend John Spink, who was a wealthy draper and banker in Bury in Suffolk. He apologises for the delay in writing, citing that he was unable to obtain a franc for the letter in a timely manner. The book also demonstrates that Sancho was sending and receiving international mail from the Caribbean, the East Indies, and elsewhere. So in the first letter in the book, written by Sancho in 1778, is addressed to his friend's son, Jack Wingrave, who was residing in India at the time, working for the East India Company. Likewise, the letter 13, written again by Sancho at his property in Charles Street on the 29th of November 1778, is addressed to Julius Obrien, who decided to move to India, or Madras in India at the time, following a bit of a scandal involving one of the Duke of Queensberry's maids. Finally, the published letters also revealed that Sancho wished to set up a post office in his shop. So the first letter is addressed to the Secretary of the Post Office, Daniel Braithwaite, on the 17th of December 1779, where Sancho submits an application, I quote, to have a general post office settled on his house. Sadly, the next letter written by Sancho, addressed to Daniel Braithwaite shortly after, on the 30th of December, indicates that his application was refused. And it's highly likely that these original letters lie undiscovered within the post office archives, housed in the National Archives at Kew or in the Postal Museum archive. And if they do, these manuscripts are going to be incredibly important, because it's evidence of one of the first applications from a Black British man to establish a post office. Sadly, current affairs with the pandemic have stopped me from I can't travel and dig them out. And the reason why such manuscripts are incredibly important is that so few of Sancho's original letters actually survive. Fortunately, those that do are housed at the British Library, and they're all addressed to the printer, journalist and bookseller William Stevenson in Norwich, or his father, Seth Ellis Stevenson. And although some were sent via private conveyance, one does bear postal markings. The following letter from Ignacio Sancho to William Stevenson here is dated the 16th of November 1779, and within it informs his friends at the end that I should have enclosed a paper, but 'twill cost the devil. And by that, I mean the receipts of Monsieur Aidan and Dunstan. So he's wanting to forward business receipts to his friend in Norwich, but found it too expensive. Now, the reverse of this letter, this particular letter, as you can see, is addressed to William Stevenson, Esquire, and Mr. Green's bookseller at Bury St Edmunds, Suffolk. And it's got a 3p rate on it, in addition to a 16th November bishop's mark, indicating it was posted and delivered by the post office. Sancho was also a dedicated husband and father, and in 1760 he married a West Indian woman named Anne Osborne, and the couple went on to have 7 children: Frances Joanna, Anne Alice, Elizabeth Bruce, who we're going to talk about soon, Jonathan William, Lydia, Catherine, Margaret, and William Leach Osborne, who we will also talk about. Now, recognising the value of literacy, he taught his children to read and write, thereby revealing to be an attentive father. And we know we can read and write from the following case study. We have some letters here from his daughter, Elizabeth Bruce, particularly early examples of a Black British woman using the postal service. And the following one here was written by Elizabeth Sancho on the 26th of May, 1818. And it's addressed to her late father's friend, William Stevenson, and once more directed to his address at Surrey Street in Norwich. And the postal markings, as you can see, there's a rate on there, and it's been split in two as the letters open up, but you've also got a postal marking. Here's another example of a letter written by Elizabeth Sancho to William Stevenson, and this time it's addressed to his address in Surrey Street, Norwich, and it's dated the 29th of February 1820. And once again, there's a presence of postal rates and markings on the delivery instructions, indicating use of the postal service. The next case study is a letter from Ignacio Sancho's son William, who at the time of writing this letter was imprisoned for debt at Newgate. Actually, in Britain at the time, if you were in debt, you could quite literally be locked up until the debt was repaid, which was rather harsh. And Charles Dickens' father was one such example of this. The letter itself, written from Newgate, depicted here, dates the 14th of February 1809, and it's addressed to William Stevenson, bookseller in Norwich. Without money, delivery via the post, of course, wouldn't have been an option. And the lack of postal markings on the manuscript indicate it must have been sent from London to Norwich by some means of private conveyance. The following case study focuses on the postal history of Sancho's contemporary, Olade Ariano, also known as Gustavus Vasa. Now, born in the Igbo region of present-day southeastern Nigeria, Equiano was enslaved as a child and taken to the British West Indies, where he was sold as a slave to a captain in the Royal Navy, who in turn sold him on to a Quaker trader. Through intelligent saving, trading and careful saving, Equiano was actually able to purchase his freedom in 1766, and he was residing in London. He joined the abolitionist group Sons of Africa, which comprised of Africans living in Britain, and a lot of their lobbying was done by letters, and to find some of the originals of those would be fantastic. He was active among the leaders of the anti-slave trade movement in the 1780s, and he published his autobiography depicted here, the interesting narrative of the life of Largo Equiano in 1789. It depicts the horrors of slavery very graphically, and the book was a bestseller, going through 9 editions, and kind of helped gain passage of the British Slave Trade Act of 1807, attempting to abolish the African slave trade in Britain. Now, although few of Equiano's original letters survive, there's one housed in the archives and manuscript section at the Wellcome collection just up the road from the British Library. And this one was written by Largo Equiano in Colchester on the 20th of June 1794. And you can see here on this occasion, probably in reference to the way people struggle with unfamiliar names, he's addressed it as Gustavus Vasa, the African. It's addressed to a Mr. or Mrs. Liversedge, drapers in Ipswich. And the letter details his recent trip to London to see one of the King's messengers, and also reports on the continuing sale of his book. The delivery instructions reveal Equiano's letter was addressed there. There's a 2p postage rate on there, as well as a Colchester circular hand stake indicating it was sent via the post office in Colchester. White abolitionists also shared news, celebrated victories, and campaigned by letters and postal communication. A nice example from the library's collections include this letter written by the female novelist, diarist, and playwright Frances Burnie. And it was written in Bath on the 27th of June 1816, and it's addressed to the famous politician and abolitionist William Wilberforce. Within the letter, she was married to a Frenchman, and at the outbreak of the Napoleonic War, she ended up being kind of semi-exiled in France. And in this letter to Wilberforce, she's recalling her pleasure back in 1807 when she learned about the abolition of the slave trade. Now, what's interesting about this letter is it was returned to Burnie by Wilberforce, who franked it with the notation that it had been unintentionally left in his carriage. And there's a very faint marking where you can see Madame Darby, that's her marriage name. You can see a very faint marking for the Red Crown free hand stamp. The next case study reveals how the Postal Service quite literally helped an individual escape from slavery. So Henry Box Brown was a Virginian slave who escaped to freedom at the age of 33 by arranging to have himself mailed in a wooden crate in 1849 to abolitionists in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this escapade enabled him to become quite a famed and noted abolitionist speaker in the Northeast United States. As a public figure and fugitive slave, Brown was extremely endangered by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and he consequently fled to the United Kingdom, where he resided for the next 25 years, touring with a kind of an anti-slavery panorama, and acting as also working as a magician and a performer. And shortly after arriving in England, he published this narrative of his life, detailing his audacious escape, and it was, like I say, published in Manchester. And it includes a depiction of the moment where it's quite literally unboxed in Philadelphia and reached freedom. Now, the tale may sound rather amusing to modern ears, but I can assure you, when you read the narrative, this 27-hour journey was harrowingly painful, uncomfortable, and grueling. I mean, it was by no means a walk in the park. This case study here is based on my own personal family archive. My wife's grandmother, Helen Brown, was born and grew up in Belize City in British Honduras, and a Northern Irish grandfather served in the British Army in Kenya during the Mau Mau Rebellion, and in British Honduras, where the couple met and fell in love. They moved to Ireland and then Hackney in London, with their young daughter, my mother-in-law, during the early 1960s. And Helen kept in touch with her sister's mother and friends in Belize via letters. And the family archive includes letters sent between friends and family members in Jamaica, London, the United States, as the family began to kind of their diaspora from Belize. I've selected this because it shows how, right the way through to the modern day, postal communications has been a major way for communities to keep in touch with their families and friends, whilst retaining their identity and culture thousands of miles away from home. And there are millions of families, not just here in Britain, but around the world, which will possess such important Black British or Black historical material. And sadly, much of it will be lost to posterity unless cultural institutions, including my own, take actions to engage with these communities and help preserve the material now. And I think doing so will also be key in ensuring that our institutions remain relevant to our evolving and changing communities. During my last talk, one of my talks for the American Philatelic Society, I talked about the history of royal correspondence between Britain and Asia. And I'd now like to point back a bit to that theme by discussing royal correspondence from African rulers or Black rulers. And sometimes, even if you don't have the original letters, copies of the letters can give you real ideas about conveyance of mail, rates, routes, and so on. And the following letter here from one of the East India Company's copybooks, or India Board's copybooks, is a translation of a letter from the governor of Tigray named, forgive me if I mispronounce, Sabagadis Waldu, and it's written in Adwa, Abyssinia, on the 24th of April, 1827, and it was addressed to King George IV. Now, this letter was accompanying an embassy which included an English official named William Coffin, and coming by way of Egypt, the Ethiopian contingent of the embassy remained behind and sent Coffin forward with this letter to Europe, and it did reach England. Sadly, the embassy was a failure, but it's an example. It proves that, you know, letters from royal African letters or from Black rulers, how understudied they are. Another interesting group of royal letters survives in the British Library's collections. This one here is written by the King of Haiti, Henry Christophe, and it's addressed to a prominent abolitionist named Thomas Clarkson in London. And it's dated the 20th of November 1819, and it's written in French upon headed paper, and it carries the royal armorial bearings of Haiti, and it's one of many detailing the political and diplomatic history of this Black Caribbean government. And interestingly, this is the envelope addressed to Thomas Clarkson in London with its seal, and this was what the letter was sent to London in. And the lack of postal markings indicates it was delivered personally, which is in keeping with the way that royal letters between British and Asian rulers that's how it was done by and large. It was done via diplomatic means, or kind of an official would attend and deliver the letter in person. Our final case study comprises this illuminated royal letter from the Sultan of Zanzibar in East Africa, Said Bargashdin Said Al Busa, and it's addressed to the governor of Bombay. So this is a letter going from East Africa to India, and it acknowledges the governor's letter of introduction for Sir Bartle Frere in 1873. Now, the design of this letter is clearly influenced by much of the Persian and South Asian correspondence, which I discussed in my last talk. But by coincidence, actually, though, the individual referred to in the letter's content is very famous among philatelists for creating the first postage stamp of Asia. Because Sir Bartle Frere, of course, he commissioned the India 1852 half anna red Sindor as part of his postage reforms of Sindh province. And of course, stamps tell a rich story of Black history in terms of Black designers, Black engravers, and also subject matter on stamps, which is something that I've not touched here, but it shows how huge and untapped this really important cultural cachet of material is. So to conclude, you know, it's really obvious. I mean, I was being rather rhetorical in the title. I think we can firmly state there is a very strong Black postal history, and it cuts across a range of traditional and modern philatelic sources and touches on an enormously diverse range of themes, issues, and subjects. And what I hope, I mean, I probably got lots wrong. What I hope is that it'll ignite further discussion, debate, and research on this theme. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.
That was fantastic. And I know that we do have people on the line who study Black postal history intimately. We've got Howard Ingram, who's the vice president of ESPER. He's on the call. He'll be speaking on Friday. And then Charlene Blair, she's also on the call. I don't know if, I know Charlene had a question about the seal. Charlene,
yeah, it was on the one. Yeah, Richard, I really enjoyed it. Definitely opened up another avenue of things to discuss. I think even when I did my chat, you mentioned, did I have any of these things? And I have not. Just started getting into looking at letters and things. I just, the Black History 101 Mobile Museum was here in the Illinois area recently, and they had a letter from Marian Anderson that she signed, and I couldn't talk him out of it. He wouldn't sell it, he wouldn't give it away. But just looking at all the items you have, I was looking at I think it's slide 34. See the back of that envelope? Right, it looks like some kind of, is it putty or paste, or did they put it on there and then put a seal on top of it to know it was them?
It's a resin. So what they would do, it's very brittle, and this is nice because it's more or less intact. And what they would do, they would heat the resin, blob it onto the back of the cover to seal it shut, and then use possibly, on this case, it would be a small hand seal. They then impress into the hot wax or resin, and then when it dries up, you get that impression. Quite common, but this is nice because, of course, that's the armorial bearings that you see on the, you know, for the royal family of Haiti. An amazing figure, Henry Christophe, in many respects. And it's quite interesting because he's adopting the kind of practices of the French court in a way. You know, you see a lot of French stationery of this kind of design, but of course, he's very anti-French at the same time. So yes, it's a lovely piece, and it's nice to have the envelope in that collection still. A real treasure.
CJ, okay. Unmute yourself, honey. There you go.
Okay, I really liked the was it a lithograph of Box Brown being?
Yeah. Yep. I can show you.
So I do a lot of research on U.S. local posts and express companies, and this is a story that I came across quite a bit when studying Adams Express. Adams Express, you know, in the U.S., at least, you know, it's kind of hard to tell with some of these when you do research because different companies want to take credit for things and paint themselves in better light. But when I was researching that company, I came across this story, and they said that he was shipped by Adams Express. And I had read about Adams Express being used a lot for people from the North sending anti-slavery stuff into the South. But also, Adams Express, when the Civil War started, they didn't want to give up that business. So they split off into a second company called Southern Express, which was not affiliated with Adams Express, except it was. And that's how they did business between the two. But I just found that interesting connection that you've talked about this, because I study U.S. postal history, but I'm interested in learning about other countries. And so most of this British stuff is new to me, but I'm glad that there was that connection there that I knew.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a brilliant little book. It's not too thick. I can't remember reading, sadly, whether he names the carrier that delivered him. I'll have to go back and check when the library reopens, and if it names the company, I'll let you know. And, you know, because you can tie that then to the source here.
That's one of the best things about us coming together is all the connections that can be made. That was excellent, Casey Joe. Hi, Markand. I see you visiting us from India. Hi, welcome. Lloyd Nutter, are you going to do us the pleasure of unmuting yourself? Do you want me to read your comment? You have.
I believe I found the button.
I have already.
No, first of all,
it is wonderful to see all of you reaching.
Thank you, Mark. And go ahead, Lloyd.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you for an excellent presentation. As a retired history teacher, I can appreciate both the historical side as well as the philatelic side, being a collector and all. And it just struck me as I was listening to your presentation that a few years ago, one of our auction houses took and published an article based on the fellow Henry Brown. And I think you can see with my poor camera here, shows you the box that he supposedly used, or a box similar to what he may have used. And so if you can come across that particular publication, it's the November-December issue of 2015. And again, I don't know, maybe the APS library perhaps has a copy, you know, kind of thing. So we'll put a plug in for them.
Thank you. Thank you. And I was going to screen share because Scott Tiffany did us a solid. This was not my idea. Richard suggested, why don't we show what we have at the library? So I'll screen share in a moment what we have, and you guys can use this little handy feature on the go-to where you could take a screenshot if you wished, but you could see what we have. No, thank you, Lloyd. Thank you for sharing that. From Beatrix, hi, hon. She doesn't have a mic. She says, University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, named after James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe University. University history shows a historical attempt to relocate his bones to a crypt here in Atlanta on University campus. Crypt area was prepared but not used. University coat of arms uses Oglethorpe family coat of arms as model.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Really interesting thing. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's quite amazing how, you know, these names and buildings associated with individuals, you know, the way postal history can show backstories to these people. Just around the corner from here, for example, there's a place called Titten Street. And I know from being the curator of the East India Company records that they were a very famous mercantile family who lived locally. Often local place names, buildings, you know, our modern urban environment, our modern geographical environment is very much shaped by this kind of history and these individuals. It's pretty amazing.
That's why, friends, I really implore you to somehow grab somebody virtually and bring them onto the chat, because they might think, oh, stamps, like, why? But then they start, you know, so many people love history. I mean, for goodness sakes, how many channels do we have on television devoted to history? And that's what this is all about, and showing it's anthropology, it's cultural, it's art. I mean, that you started to talk about the designer. I know Howard Ingram's going to talk about a stamp designer, an African-Canadian designer on Friday. So, I mean, that really ties in so much.
Yeah.
Kelleher is the name of the magazine, correct, friends? That's the auction magazine that Lloyd Nutter was talking about. All right, honey. Yeah, Rick was looking for that.
It's quite interesting, actually. I mean, one of the challenges you're going to, that sometimes it's not always easy to tell from a person's name, their race or ethnicity. And that's one of the big, that can be a challenge. So Elizabeth Bruce, for example, you wouldn't immediately equate the name. Well, there's no reason why you shouldn't today, but sometimes you can't tell race or ethnicity from name alone. So one of the challenges, I think, for postal history dealers is to do, it's not always going to be possible, but if they have any context, such as, the backstory of some of the material they're selling, it's really important that that's preserved and then sold on and passed on with the collection where possible. Because, you have a lot of postal history looking at rates and routes, but you lose a lot of the background contextual stories that led to its creation. And that's really interpersonal relationships, business, commerce. And, I think there is a challenge here for dealers to, as well as the commercial benefit, to try and capture that probably a bit more effectively now.
Well, you heard it here first on Stamp Chat. Tell the story, get the context out, advocate for it. Let me share my screen, friends, so you can see, and Penny put in a nice link. Thank you, Penny, for the link to the journal. I'm screen sharing. I'd like you to see what Scott Tiffany came up for y'all. So
Heidi, I was just trying to find a connection with that Henry Brown. I see that letter said 1851, but Wells Fargo was started in 1852, and I was trying to find an article but can't find it now, but there was some connection with him going on to either work, do something with Wells Fargo. So that's what I was trying to find the link, but I remember reading the story and worked in our heritage museum that we have here. His name and picture and everything came up on a story that they did here. So if I find that, I'll share with you. I couldn't put my hands on it. Yeah, I'm trying to do some research to find it.
I have a kind of an appeal actually to my fellow postal historians, philatelists in America. If anyone could try and seek out if there's any surviving correspondence of a woman named Phyllis Wheatley. And she was a West African slave who was taught to read and write and became a very noted poet. And she's interesting. She doesn't write boring love poetry, quite powerful political stuff. I mean, it'd be quite brave for a woman to write on some of these themes, such as the stamp tax, the 1765 Stamp Act, much less an African slave at the time. These letters were published, but if she was literate, where are her letters? Because these would date from the 1760s and push the story back even further. If anyone can find anything, please let me know, because I'm deeply fascinated by her. And I encountered her on a stamp from Senegal, and then learnt about her book, and then find out on top of that she's writing about the Stamp Act. So it just all linked really beautifully.
In case anybody wanted to look further, this is the second page there for whatever for references that Scott Tiffany pulled specifically for Black history. There are little buttons here, and there's one that looks like a camera. You can take a screenshot. So that's pretty neat. All right. Phyllis Wheatley, we have the call out for you. Kapil, wake up. I know it's like 4 o'clock in the morning in India.
Hello.
Hi,
How are you?
Welcome, darling. Welcome. So
it's 1:30 a.m. here.
1:30. Well, welcome. I'm happy that you guys showed up on the call. Do we have any? Okay, I didn't get a new. Oh, please type the name so I can be sure. Did I spell Phyllis Wheatley correctly? Richard, can you have a look at that?
I'm typing it in. I'm typing it in, Heidi. There's a group here in St. Louis that has a heritage center named after her, and they may have some additional information. So I'm typing it in now.
Matchmaker, matchmaker. That's how we work. Oh, how fun.
Oh, fantastic.
I added a link to the
Peter.
Poetry Foundation too in the chat.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Thanks, Penny. Does anybody else have anything to add to this growing
I think
body
Peter
of
does.
language of information. Howard Ingram, I'm putting you on the spot, man.
No, I don't have much to add. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Richard had responded back to me in email, Heidi, just so you know, we are talking a little bit and everything. So we'll continue to talk and whatnot. And I'm looking forward to giving my presentation on Friday on African Canadians and some of that information. I looked up this Henry Box Brown. That's a fascinating history behind him. Is actually a statue or something of him in Richmond, Virginia, which is only an hour away from where I live. I'll have to check it out the next time I go up to visit my sister there. She lives in Richmond, Virginia, so there's supposedly a box maybe or something there, a statue of him in Richmond, Virginia. He was actually born was a slave in Louisa, Virginia, which is just about 30 minutes outside of Richmond, Virginia. So, and of course we know, but I haven't done much with letters and correspondence and things of that nature, but this presentation has definitely heightened my interest in that part of the philately, and I'll be looking at it a little bit more. I've mainly been collecting Blacks, African Americans on stamps and Blacks on stamps throughout the world. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on Friday. Okay.
Thank you, Howard. You know, you have a standing invitation. You know, look, it's important. The more diverse we can show our hobby to be, I think we all enjoy learning. I think that's why we come here every day at 3 or at 7 p.m. because we're geeks. We love to learn. And
yes.
So the more we can learn about different cultures and around the world, it behooves us. Peter Little, let me get to you before our 4 o'clock arrives. You had a question or comment, sir.
Yeah, in military history, they talk about the ships sailing to the West Indies with the slave trade people and then coming back to Europe with the goods that were exchanged for the slaves. But in military history, they tell you that roughly out of every 5 ships that sailed, probably only 3 to 4 made it. And I wondered if Richard had any idea of how much Black postal history was lost between, say, 1600 and 1800, because that's a tremendous amount. That's a tremendous loss of life, communication, paperwork, goods, everything. If you think about it, and the insurers used to work it out. The lawyers and insurers used to work it out. For every so many ships sent across the Atlantic, they knew only so many would make it, so they sent extras to make up for the losses. And I just wondered if there was any history there that suggested what was lost and how many of these Black Africans who became almost Europeans didn't make it.
In terms of the human loss, I don't know if anyone's quantified it, but theoretically it would be quantifiable because there would have been insurance claims. You could identify ships that went down, work out the approximate size of the human cargo. Forgive the expression, but that's how it would have been dealt with in the correspondence. Most commercial setups would have often sent their mail in duplicate or triplicate to avoid shipwrecks or even in war. Sadly, working out the amount of correspondence that went, personal correspondence that went down with the ship, wouldn't necessarily be possible to calculate, sadly. But often letters will make, most letters at this time, you would make immediate reference in the opening statement to your preceding letter. And there was a lot of early correspondence that this period talked about, you know, oh, my last letter sent. Sometimes they might put a duplicate in, or they might make internal reference in the letter. But in terms of quantifying the lost postal history, it'd be very difficult. It would be difficult. Like I say, for the loss of life in that situation, you could quantify that theoretically, and I'd imagine it'd be a horrible number. A lot of ships went down. There is a big project looking at prize papers, correspondence that was seized in war, and that's been done by the National Archives. And one wonders, as they digitize that, what will become available. I mean, the letters from Ignacio Sancho I found on a digital resource at the British Library, the Discovering Literature resource, which is fantastic. And the same with the letter from Gustavus Vassa, that was online research. And you know, for museums, we're looking more and more at getting this kind of content online. I think it's going to open a lot of opportunities, and I think there's a huge untapped resource. I mean, one of the things, the aim of this paper is to show the value of archival-based research, and not just research and publishing on our collections, but going into local archives, national archives, looking through their material, because the bulk of the archive will be correspondence. And that's what I've done. I don't own any of this. I went into my collections and various collections and looked through. And I'd urge postal historians, you know, you're going to find treasures, untold treasures, buried away in archives, not just in the UK, but in the US, in India, in China, just waiting to be untapped. So, you know, explore, have fun. That's my advice.
Well, and thank you, Dr. Morel from the British Public Library for joining us once again on Stamp Chat. Friends, it's 4:02. I know that we still have, take a look at the chat box because it is loaded with just love and ideas for cruises and adventures together once this thing is over. And Penny sent a lot of nice, I took screenshots for you, Richard, that I can send you, but with
thank you.
Wheatley, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you so much, everybody, for your thoughts and sharing. Again, we've got a lot of friends out there that love family genealogy. Bring them on the show. You know, just have them sit down, make them a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, whatever, and have them just sit here and chill and pique some interest. Because like Richard just said, archives are loaded with just jewels. It's a geode, you know, you just knock that rock open and whoa. So Penny knows it. She's a genealogist, so she gets it. But anyway, friends, thank you. Remember you can support digital research by adopting a book. Tomorrow we have Unveiling Summer Seminar, so you won't want to miss that. That's at 3 o'clock. And at 7 p.m., we have Kurt Streepy talking about collecting first issues of the world. So you don't want to miss either one of those. And if you do, you can always find us on APS YouTube, where they're under the playlist Stamp Chat. So thank you so much for joining us, friends. Take a look at that chat box in case you need any references. Otherwise, shalom, aloha, peace, namaste. Thank you, friends, for joining us. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, friends.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye, friends. Bye.
Bye. Bye.